Well, I want to welcome everybody. Today we're going to have a conversation related to K-12 and project-based learning, and maybe even drill a little deeper into STEM education and what that means. Before we begin with the conversation, I think introductions around the table might be the place to start. Mr. Brock, will you get us started?
Well, I'm John Brock. I've always been interested in education, and so we started the Brock Prize, which is the result of getting all these folks together.
Okay.
Teresa.
All right, so I'm Dr. Teresa Cullen. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education here at OU. And I'm an Apple Distinguished Educator. I run our one-to-one iPad program and also an online master's degree in 21st century teaching and learning for practicing teachers. And I have a lot of interest in questions about access and how can we make that leap between project-based learning and higher education. I'm also leading a group right now through the Center for Teaching Excellence at OU, talking about what students are going to look like 5 years from now and how we need to change how we're teaching.
Good. Well, my name is Rick Miller, and I'm the president of Olin College of Engineering in Massachusetts, and I'm here today because of the Brock Prize.
I'm Ed Harris. I'm the administrator for the Brock Prize in Education, and I'm here because Rick Miller is here.
And I'm Tim Laubach. I'm in science education, associate professor in the College of Education, interested in science and how it can connect with STEM education.
Right. And my name is Greg Garn. I'm the dean in the Janine Rainbow College of Education and serving in the role of moderator today. So we'll kind of get the conversation going. Maybe the place to begin is thinking about project-based learning as sort of a foundational tool for learning, whether it's STEM or other kinds of subjects. President Miller, would you get us started a little bit from the higher ed perspective and what that looks like at your institution? And then let's see if we can get some connections to K-12 and move the conversation from there.
Sure. Project-based learning is it's all about experience and learning from doing rather than learning from hearing about something. We learned about this at Olin through an experience which was quite unique, where we had 15 boys and girls who spent a year in construction trailers on a parking lot while our campus was being built. And our idea there was to use that year to do experiments that can't be done when you're offering courses for credit and students need to succeed in order to graduate. So we designed the experiments to fail. So one of the first experiments that we did, after talking to each other about what you remember about your undergraduate education and realizing we didn't remember anything except the project, we asked, why do you wait until the end of the entire 4-year program, the last semester, before you do it? And we couldn't answer that question. The most plausible hypothesis was that you had to have all this calculus and physics before you picked up a wrench, because maybe you were violating some law of nature and you'd get struck by lightning or something if you picked one up. So let's try this. We put these kids together on a project. We told them we want you to design, build, and demonstrate a pulse oximeter, and to do this within 5 weeks. And they said, excuse me, a what? And so we spelled the word, and we said, this is the medical instrument you find in the hospital. They clip it on your finger. It measures the pulse rate and the oxygen content in your blood. It doesn't stick a hole in you with a needle. It has a light that looks through the skin. And they said, cool, where do we learn about it? We said, why don't you go to the internet and look in the patent literature, because the person who invented it has to have a little schematic diagram and a one-page description of what it does. And if you have questions, we'll be around. We have 5 weeks, though, and this is not an SAT test, so you can talk to your uncle, your aunt who works at a hospital, that's okay. But you have to have it working in 5 weeks. And we figured there's no way. I mean, they haven't had any college at all. This diagram is going to have transistors on it. They don't know what a transistor is. They haven't had any of the semiconductor physics. But we'll end it in 5 weeks, and we'll do a postmortem to figure out where they got stuck. That was the idea. But something very strange happened. In 5 weeks, they had one working. We were shocked. So we brought in a hospital version, we put them side by side, and they were doing the same thing. Now don't get me wrong, you would not want to buy this thing. If you looked at the soldering job, it was a bit of a miracle that it worked because, and they had a box full of fried transistors that all blew up because they went in backwards. So these were not physicists, but they built one and they made it work. And we learned two things from this that we had not expected. The first one was, no, you don't need 2 years of calculus and physics to make things. Of course not. You know, the Wright brothers invented the aircraft industry. These were two bicycle mechanics in Ohio. These were not physicists at a laboratory in a university. They did this through the process of engineering, which involves trial and error. The process, by the way, is of fundamental interest. It's engaging. Kids love this. And we began to conclude 2 or 3 things from this. Number one, every kid is probably born with an innate interest in 2 things, a mystery story and in making things. You don't have to teach them that. They're innately interested in it. And when science is taught properly, it's a mystery story. It's not a bunch of facts that you memorize. And secondly, engineering is about making things. And if you just go with that from kindergarten, kids will always be interested in engineering. So those are some really important aspects. Another thing that we learned is that engineering is not a body of knowledge. It involves knowledge, don't get me wrong, but engineering is a process. And the process is inherently engaging, adventurous, and uncertain. You try things, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but you build up a sense of empowerment and accomplishment when you get to the answer that exceeds your own expectations.
So I want to pick up on one of the ideas about failure and the way that maybe that perception differs in what you've just described versus K-12. So in the Wright brothers example that you talked about, a lot of people explain their success because they're detailed diaries of failure. They were able to sort of step away from some of the common perceptions, experience it, document it, and then over time overcome it. In K-12, there's a fairly different perspective. Now, maybe that perception is changing a little bit, but you know, Terry or Tim, would you talk a little bit about the role of failure in testing in K-12 compared to what President Miller just talked about in sort of the philosophy of starting a very different kind of higher ed institution?
Well, I would just say that, you know, in K-12, you know, of course, you know, with like A through F ratings in schools, you know, they're looking at students looking at their annual progress, and of course they're looking for them to always be doubling it. And you know, one of the issues that we've had is schools that were performing well the following year would perform badly because they didn't make a huge gain because they were already doing well, and that's kind of one of the issues. I think I might redirect a little bit in that there is some movements in K-12 though that I think are hopeful. I think I have a lot of the teachers that are in my 21st Century Master's program who are using things like Genius Hour, which is a growing movement in education where we're gonna take 1 day a week, or we're gonna take 10% of your time. It's based on Google's model, which they give Google engineers 20% of their time to work on any problem that interests them. So the students have to choose their own problem. The problem is it's outside the curriculum. It's not necessarily preparing them for the test. And so I think that's an interesting movement there, is that the idea that we have teachers as looking at their extra materials, that they're focusing on, as their enrichment per se, actually doing these kind of real world problem solving, which you would love those students to be coming to Olin. I think there's another really interesting movement that's going on that I just saw Tony Wagner writing about through the Independent School Association. There's a thing that's called mastery.org, which is that they want to change high school transcripts. And they want to be looking at problem-based and 21st century skills in those transcripts. And they want to not be as focused on grades. One of their arguments is that high schools should not give you mental health problems. That's actually one of the things that's on their website. You shouldn't feel anxiety and depression over high school. You should be getting ready to go on and do in the world. A third movement that I think is really interesting in well, it's kind of actually a higher ed movement. I don't know, are you familiar with the Wayfinding Academy?
No.
Oh, this is something I'm really excited about that I'm going to actually go visit at the end of this month. And it's a group of professors who've left higher ed and have started an academy, a two-year academy for students that decide that I want to do this before going to college. Mm-hmm. And they get an associate's degree, but what they do is they engage in internships, problem-based learning. They service of some kind. That's the idea about like, where do you want to be in the world and how do you want to change the world? And I think that's a really exciting thing to start to see people realizing is a question that should be answered before college. You know, how am I going to do problem-based learning? How, you know, what are the questions that really interest me, so that we don't have a child who goes through college and gets a degree in business or engineering because they were told they'd make a lot of money, and then be like, I want to, I think about I think it's in Tony Wagner's book, Creating Innovators. He talks about a student who went through the whole process and then graduated with a degree in engineering and then decided that they wanted to make movies. I think that's the right book. Anyway, and so it's just a very interesting thing. So I think some of what we're doing as extra to those tests is really creating some positive change. And what I hope is that people are starting to notice those things that are really enriching students' lives that go beyond the test, that those are influencing those test scores, and that we're going to start to wonder, why aren't we spending more than 20% of our time on this kind of activity?
Thank you. Tim, any additional thoughts related to sort of the differences or the potential of failure as a positive versus a tragedy to be avoided?
Yeah, so current assessments focus on success, not failures. And until we can redesign our assessments, innovative teaching methodologies will be misaligned. And so we could argue that providing students these opportunities in a problem-based or a project-based environment would equip them with the knowledge and skills that are subject-specific or, in addition, life-specific, that are transferable. I think that change should occur in the standardized test, and that's where the difficulty arises. It's easy to grade a forced choice, multiple choice, but now where you're asked to explain your process of solving a problem, there's more subjectivity. And so I do see hope in speaking for science in particular. I mean, there is an emphasis on design, and so waiting to see what those assessments will look like. If it's effective, hopefully that will drive instruction in a proper way, because oftentimes assessment does drive instruction in an improper way. So hopefully we can get that alignment, but it's going to take time.
One of the things, Rick, that you said that interested me is that you said that this was, in a way, I forgot your exact terms, but it was sort of set up for failure. In other words, it was assumed that this was going to fail. But at the same time, that was okay because it was going to be a learning experience, and you would learn from these failures and move on. And I think that is a huge paradigm change. I think Teresa and Tim are bringing up some very interesting things that are very encouraging about K-12 and higher ed too, about maybe a difference in looking at that paradigm. But for us, right now, it's, pass, fail. It's not, and it sets up a culture where the failures, people are actually afraid to fail. And you really can't do that in innovation.
It's that whole mindset of avoidance of failure at all costs is guaranteed to prevent you from ever learning anything that isn't incremental. So for example, if you wanted to learn how to ride a bike, but life would be over if you ever fell, my bet is you would never get on the bike. I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody who learned how to ride a bike who never fell. That's not the point. In fact, you have to learn to survive the falling, and that you have to have more momentum and be going fast in order to avoid falling. And you have to start from a standing start, so that's an inherent conflict. So that mentality has to be ended. The way we started this as engineers, for example, in my background, I was an aerospace consultant for 15 years or so before getting too deeply involved in education. And I have a number of PhD students who work at Boeing. So before Boeing puts any passengers in a 787 airplane, they first take it into a special hangar and pull the wings off of it, literally. They destroy one on purpose, and they measure everything that's going on when it's coming apart. By the way, you don't want to be in this hangar when this happens. This is a very violent test. But they do this for a reason, because they're double checking all the calculations, all the things that people have assumed will happen when the stress gets too high and so forth. They can actually see. So our vision of that first year with those kids that are spending this time doing experiments that are designed to fail is we're pulling the wings off of higher education. What happens when you do that? And one of the things that we learned, almost without exception, I believe, people underestimate what kids are capable of doing. And I'll bet you that's universally true. We do this because we're overstructuring it to make sure that nobody could ever fail. Okay? And by doing that, we make sure that nobody achieves what they're really capable of doing, which is ironic, but I think is inherent. Another interesting thing about this is an assessment, which I think drives a lot of this. Nobody wants an education system that graduates kids that can't do anything. And that's what we're trying to fix. So I don't think they're bad people who want to assess things. But we have to be much more intelligent about how we do it. And one of the things that we've learned is assessment in the arts is way more successful than assessment in what we've been doing in the sciences. So if you think about it, in the arts, you can't use a bell-shaped curve. So if you have everybody in a painting class and they're painting something they like, nobody else is painting what you chose. You're the only one. So the bell-shaped curve has only one point on it. How do you know? And if you do the assessment correctly, so let me explain it this way. So if you were learning how to play the violin and your assessment was to record your violin piece in a practice room with a tape recorder and give it to your instructor, you have a completely different outcome than if you play that piece on stage at Carnegie Hall. Okay? That doesn't just change what you know, it changes who you are. And it's this business of changing who you are, this attitudes, behaviors, and motivations, which is the gold standard. The most valuable assessments in life, I believe, and I think this is true almost anywhere you go. I've never found a CEO of a company who recruits people based on their resume, or their test score, or their SATs, or their GPA. They meet them first. If assessment is all about the test scores, why do we bother to meet people, right? We have the numbers. It turns out you're assessing something more fundamental, more subjective than that, which turns out to be the most valuable thing you have. Part of our word for this now, in terms of attitudes, behavior, and motivations, is calling it a mindset. And that really determines more than your test scores do. I think the arts and the whole methodology of assessment in the arts has more to offer than applying big data and statistics to thousands of students taking a multiple choice test off of a MOOC. This is just my own bias. Final thing I'll say about this is there's only a slight change in framing, in thinking about problem-based learning, and in thinking about design-based learning. Okay, now they're almost the same, but they're not quite. The difference is, in problem-based learning, the teacher has given you a kit. Okay, they've already decided you could do this. We have all the parts that you need. It's all packaged. We even have some blueprints. And go assemble as expected. Right, follow the directions. So this is what I'd call paint by numbers. Remember those sets when you were a kid? But design-based learning has no numbers. Design-based learning starts with a blank sheet. You have to first decide what to draw and what to paint. It's a slight expansion but it exercises a completely different part of the brain. And it's also this huge human need for self-expression, which we suppress when it's all follow the directions, is critical to success. And you could easily build this in if, like in an 8-hour day, if you had 1 hour designed deliberately in the curriculum to expose kids to a design-based project where you have to improvise. And improvisation, even in fact, if you look at how music is taught, I mean, if there are musicians in the group, if you look at classical music, it uses a different side of the brain, and it's about perfect execution of the notes that Beethoven wrote hundreds of years ago, okay? But jazz, improvisation, is completely different. No jazz musician can tell you what they're going to play before the concert because it's a conversation. And you can't tell me what you're going to say 5 minutes from now because it depends on what I'm going to say. You improvise this online. You have to have an idea in your head, and yes, there are some rules about how we articulate this, how you get your conversation in a polite way and so forth. But it uses a different part of the brain, and it's the same part of the brain that you use in creativity and in the arts and in invention. And I'm just worried that this obsession with bell-shaped curves is extinguishing any exposure to this sort of creative development of the brain in kids when they're young. And I'm crazy enough to believe that the conversations that I've heard about eliminating longhand script handwriting among kids may have consequences that we don't yet understand. It worries me a lot.
So could I ask
Please.
a follow-up? Okay, so you said so many really interesting things. You kind of made me think a little bit about, the video of Randy Pausch.
Yeah.
When he did his last lecture, if you remember,
Yes.
from Carnegie Mellon, and he talks about the first class he taught, and the students completed all of his objectives at the end of the first assignment. And he called his mentor, and he said, "What do I say to you?" And the mentor said to him, "You need to go back in there and say, that was pretty good, but I know you can do better, because
Yeah.
clearly you don't understand your students."
Yeah.
And I often think about that example because it's a beautiful example. I guess the question that I'd like to ask for you is, I think about even when I was a high school teacher.
Yes.
I had a student who they said, "Wow, she's going to be a doctor. She's going to be a doctor." And I gave her a simple problem. I gave her a plastic bag with baking soda and vinegar and 2 twist ties and a scale. And I said, "Prove to me the conservation of mass in an experiment." And the whole idea of it is that you take the plastic bag, you put the baking soda in a corner, tie it off, put the vinegar in another, tie the whole bag off, weigh it, undo the tie, shake the bag, weigh the bag, and the bag will weigh the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole proof. This girl was in the fetal position, rocking back and forth in the corner, saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And what's on the test? What do I have to know? And I said, no, this is a problem. You have to figure it out. So the question that I bring to you from that example is that person was tagged as, that's going to be a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that's not going to be a doctor, because that's not the skill a doctor needs. But she was very good at school, excellent at school. I guess the question that I'm wondering is, when we talk about, when you look at students coming into Olin, since you have a great reputation, you're able to pick from the cream of the crop, people who have been preparing their whole life, like an Olympian prepares for the Olympics. And my question is what would you like to see in K-12 that would prepare students for the new economy? What do you think should be emphasized, and how do you think things should change?
Yeah, we don't have enough time for the full answer to this.
Yeah, that's like, there's a little
Yeah,
loaded.
yeah. But a lot of things you said, I think, are really important. So one of the things that we talk about a lot, whether you're doing the right thing in teaching, you can tell by the questions the students ask. So, and we call it intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. So if you're talking to a class and the questions are all about, will this be on the test, that reveals extrinsic motivation. Okay, I'm doing this because I need to get a score. I want to put an X in the box to move on. If the questions, though, are different, if they are, I've been thinking, and I ran into this this person on the weekend that was building a model airplane, and I didn't understand why the wings did what it did. Can you explain to me why that happens? That's an intrinsically motivated question where the student has taken the initiative and has a project in their head where they're trying to understand how to make this work. Okay? If the majority of the questions are of that kind, you have people who will learn on their own. And so the real question is, what can we do in the way we educate people to encourage that kind of intrinsic motivation about something you care about? The methodology which we're currently using, and they're probably better, we just haven't run into them, is this design thinking incorporated with an exercise that's deliberately aimed at trying to identify something that you care about. So, I can tell you this one little story. It'll take a minute, but every kid has to take this class in about the second semester. They're in teams of about 5, so it's just about like the number of us sitting around this table. And we ask them one thing. We would like for you to identify a group of people whose lives you would like to change. Not someday, but within 4 months. Okay, and then we talk, tell me what you want. And we were pretty accommodating, almost anybody that they would come up with. But and just to give a texture, I'll give you a real case study. So in this one example, this group of students said, well, my grandmother got Alzheimer's last year, and she's in assisted living now. So we went to visit her there. I've never been to a place like that. I would like to do something to improve the lives of the elderly. Okay, so that's a good idea. So then what we did is we identified 10 elderly people who live within a 10-minute drive of campus who would be willing to talk to these 5 students for about 2 hours over a 2-week period. So that means they did 20 hours of interviews over 2 weeks. And then they came home and they constructed a sociological profile of these people that they met, okay? Basically answering the question, what does it mean to be elderly today in America? What does it mean in terms of age, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of what keeps you up at night? And you know what they heard? It was a very common theme, which they could repeat very clearly. All of them knew some friend who had an unexpected fall, broke their hip, which didn't heal well, and for the rest of their life they're in a wheelchair. So they're quite worried about mobility. In fact, they told us things like, well, once you're in the wheelchair, you can't look people in the eye anymore. You can only look at them in the belt buckle. And when people gather around to talk to you, they talk over your head and they talk about you in the third person. There's a huge psychological thing they were worried about. In addition to that, they said your metabolism changes now. So you can't walk, so you can't burn as many calories, and so it's difficult to maintain your weight. In fact, it's even hard to know what your weight is. You have to have all this help, to get on the scale. And so they were pondering this for about a week. What can we do? And they eventually came up with the idea, just brainstorming, maybe we can't do much about the aging thing, okay? We're only 19. Maybe we could do something about the weight thing. So maybe we could, and we don't know this because we haven't had the classes yet, but maybe we could invent a little carpet with pressure sensors on it, and you could drive the wheelchair onto the carpet, and there's an RFID radio transmitter on this that sends a signal to your cell phone, which has software that subtracts out the weight of the wheelchair, and it tells you exactly what you weigh. Would that be of any interest to you? And these people that they met just went ballistic. They said, you could actually do that? Well, maybe. We think we can. Then they came home and they were on fire. Okay, so this is how project-based learning becomes design-based learning with intrinsic motivation built in. So in about another month, they were all over the campus. Who on this campus knows anything about pressure sensors? Okay, who knows anything about radio transmission and software design? And in 3 months, they built a prototype. Okay, and they're 19. They have an idea which is now patentable. They have a group of people who they really care about. They have images in their head. They know exactly who they are, and they're on fire to do something about it. The next course in the curriculum is how to start and run a business. Okay, which teaches you, if you have a product and you have a market, here are the different ways you can go about this. Where could you get capital? They built this business plan. They won the Babson College Business Plan competition the next semester. You can now buy these things online. It's called LilyPad Scales. And the kids who did that turned down going to graduate school or going to work for Boeing in order to work on their own project for a couple of years until they built one. Now I think they've gone on to graduate school after they've sort of gotten it in. But the point that I'm getting at is intrinsic motivation in this sense of they're real people that I could touch means that all of their questions were about who on this campus knows anything about pressure sensors. It wasn't about is this going to be on the test, okay? And that kind of education we're calling transformative. And in fact, if you do that all the way through, something unexpected happened at commencement. We noticed this. If you watch the kids walk across the stage and get their diploma, they not only have the knowledge they need for a job and the skill for how to apply it, which is what we were teaching, they have something else. They have a really strong head start towards what I would call a purpose or a mission or a calling in life. They are not going to go home and live with their parents through their 20s and try to figure out what to do with this degree in history. You got to put a leash on them because they're ready to go to Africa. They want to build food for the starving masses. They're they're excited. And my question is, how much is that worth to you? And I can tell you, most of the letters that I get from parents are about that. They'll tell me, you know, Johnny was a geeky kid in high school. He was always the top of the math class, but he'd never been on a date. You know, he was quite shy. He was a little fragile. We didn't want to send him to the local state university because he was afraid to get lost. But he couldn't get lost at Olin's, too small. And what did you do to him? Now he's come home and he wants to go on stage at the TED Talks. He's out trying to you know, and that, I think, could be done at OU. I think that could be done at any institution. It does not take every faculty member to do this. I think only a few could turn the knob. The Gallup data that we're seeing about what really matters in higher ed says there's a huge tipping point among those graduates who answered yes to the question, did you ever have a teacher as an undergraduate who cared about you as a person, okay? Who inspired your learning and who nurtured your dreams when you left? If you answer yes to this, and you also had the opportunity to apply something that you learned in school in a real-world environment, it changes everything. You have now twice the likelihood of a positive life outcome in mid-career.
You know, that's why I'm a professor.
Is that right?
Because
that happened to you?
I had a connection with a professor at Northwest Missouri State, and I was an out-of-state student, and that was rare there.
Yeah.
And I house sat for her, and she invited me to go to the discussions with other professors, like, you know, like go out for a beer on Friday night.
Yes.
And I got to see what professors were talking about. And I thought, this is it, man. Like, these are the kind of people, I want to be talking about these big ideas.
Yes.
It's amazing. And what's been interesting is that she's reached out to me several times since when she had other students to pay it forward. And it's about that network, and it's about that culture. And it sounds like you have a wonderful culture at Olin.
Yeah, it really is about the culture. Yeah. But the thing that strikes me is that data, that Gallup data says, did you have at least one faculty member? Most kids have, let's say, between 35 and 40 courses before you graduate, right? Yeah. So if you have one, so that's like 2, 3, 4% of the faculty that really made the connection. You don't have to have every faculty member on board. You need about, I'm going to say 10%, and then you've got 3 times more than you really need. You could make it work.
It should be a very reachable goal. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound like a
Yeah.
Just one.
Yeah.
Let me follow up and make a connection. So one of the things that you described was really an integration. So ultimately, you're preparing an engineer that needs to be successful with a set of knowledge.
Yes.
What you described is blending the social sciences with the set of learning standards that it takes to become an engineer.
Yes.
I want to sort of connect to Dr. Laubach and think about, in science education, how do learning standards, or the way that we view learning standards, can that be a launching pad to do what President Miller is talking about, or is that potentially a limitation? I'd love to get your perspective on sort of the role of those learning standards in K-12 and how that might help or inhibit.
So with the release of the Next Generation Science Standards, there was an explicit effort to make engineering more visible. It was implicit in the previous standards, the National Science Ed Standards, under technological design. And so National Academies of Sciences, National Research Council, and all the other the framework writers saw the need to make engineering more accessible and use science as that content area that you could make that link. And so in that set of standards, states were given the opportunities to adopt in whole or adapt. Oklahoma chose to adapt. So our standards are fairly aligned to the Next Generation Science Standards. And the piece that's there, beginning in kindergarten, is engineering and the design. In fact, students are asked to design and build beginning in kindergarten. The idea of failure doesn't really become visible until about 3rd, 4th grade, when they're given an opportunity to redesign and evaluate and look at constraints and criteria and really look at that from an evaluative standpoint. So the support there from a standards perspective is there for K-12. Now the issue is providing professional development for current teachers who did not learn that way, and then working with pre-service teachers on our campus so that when they go conduct a field experience, they still not be seeing it, but convincing them that we need to be thinking this way. And looking at engineering as a way to apply what they're learning in science and mathematics and the arts and social science. The issue I have, and I think maybe, I don't know if it's cynic or skeptic, is that until we kind of dissolve the subject-centric silos, the idea of integration is extremely difficult for teachers. First-hand experience, 6 years working on a math-science partnership grant with middle school math and science teachers. First task was getting them just to talk to each other and to realize they're saying different things that mean the same thing. Rate, slope.
Right.
And so starting with that and then looking at educational opportunities to say what experiences can we provide our students that, one, would either give them that space to acquire knowledge to solve it or apply the knowledge they're learning somewhere else. So one of the issues is curriculum alignment and timing. So maybe an essential math skill or understanding that would be requisite to really deep diving into this problem, that could be a spring semester standard. But yet we're in the fall and we need it now. And so then that leaves the science teacher kind of in a quandary like, man, is that my space? The math teacher says I would love to help, but we don't get to this until. And so we're trying to convince those teachers is that you control. I mean, we have standards, but if we're working together, bottom line is our students achieving? Are they meeting these standards? How they meet it, I mean, to me, that should be left up to the teachers and teachers. So I feel like one of the focal points of STEM and STEM education is looking at it from an integrated approach. And just because I'm teaching science doesn't mean I'm teaching STEM. And that's my bias. I really feel like you have to look at it holistically and not individualistically. So there is hope. But again, as I said before with assessment, I think it will just take time for that culture change, that paradigm shift. And it's going to be significant.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me, I can understand why you would package engineering in the science part of the curriculum, but there's some parts of that that are unfortunate too, because science and engineering are not the same thing. In many ways, they're the opposite. So scientists ask why when they try to understand what happened in the world. It's all about hypothesis testing, where engineers ask why not when they're trying to change the world. And in fact, you don't need science to be an engineer. I mean, the Wright brothers proved that. In fact, our definition, which seems to be working pretty well for us right now, is that an engineer is a person who envisions what has never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen. Doesn't even mention science or math. I mean, it's there, but it begins with vision. And so as a result, one of our first graduates at Olin is a movie producer in Hollywood. He does documentary films. For us, that's an engineer. Every day he envisions what has never been, and he does whatever it takes to make it happen, which might involve science, okay? But it might not, too. In fact, we teach them separately. We start with engineering on day one. They have to all conceive and design and build a device which mimics something that they saw in nature. So one of the first things they do is they go out and observe grasshoppers. How do these things work anyway? They look at high-speed films of their legs, and there's these little hairs that cock, and they store some spring energy, and then they release it. Then they go and they design something that maybe is inspired by that on a CAD program. They all have CAD on their laptop, and then they go into the shop, and they're all proved, checked out and proven to be safe in a shop within the first couple of weeks, so they can go build stuff 24/7, and they just make things and they try them. They don't have any science yet. They're not writing any equations because you don't need science to actually conceive things and to make them. And then later we add the power tools. Okay, so to me it's like trying to learn how to be a carpenter. The way we're doing this by overemphasizing science is that you've never picked up a handsaw or made a birdhouse yet. But we're going to teach you how to use a table saw, a circular saw, a lathe, you know, all this stuff, and here's how the power works and so forth, but you never actually put any wood in it. It's backwards. I mean, you should know what it is. You have a good holistic view of what you don't need the power saw to make the birdhouse, okay? And then you need it, though, to make a house because it makes it more efficient. So there's that aspect of it. There's another piece. I'm delighted to hear that the National Academies are helping push in this direction and that you're aligned with that here. So it does, it makes it okay to try experiments in this direction. But we still have, I think, a huge gap in understanding and appreciation among K-12 teachers of what an engineer is and what they do. What does a life of an engineer look like? And we have that same problem with faculty at universities too. This may not be obvious, but my own background, I think you could go back a couple of generations with all of my mentors and thesis advisors before you found anybody who actually engineered anything. They were guys who wrote papers about the science behind it, but nobody got a paycheck for being an engineer. This is really unusual. If you go to a medical school, almost all faculty members in the medical school earn most of their pay from being a real physician, seeing real patients in the clinic. As part of them, they get a very small part of that for education. And it's quite common in the law school for the dean of the law school to be a retired judge who just came from practicing law somewhere and swaps places. So he actually knows what the practice of law is about. Try to find that in the engineering school, okay? It's very, very rare to find an engineer who actually worked as an engineer. We're trying to fix that now, but we got some work to do. Nevertheless, I think it's going to be hard for a middle school teacher to come up with a curriculum that exposes students to the thinking of engineering, just distinct from science, without having a model somewhere, or somebody that maybe if they're married to an engineer, I don't know, how you do that. And I think we have some work to do to try to bring K-12 teachers into an engineering workplace to actually watch it happen. I mean, like for example, go to Google in the summer and see how they design apps for your computer. That'll be a prerequisite.
I think that there's movement going there, though,
Yeah.
and I'll tell you where I think a lot of that movement is going is there's this whole movement of kind of teacher-published professional development books.
Yeah.
And there's like the Teach Like a Pirate and the Hack Learning and the Genius Hour. Those were
Yes,
all
yes.
teacher-written books.
Yes.
Because now, because of the self-publishing field, and if you want to think of these teachers as almost engineering teachers
Yes,
per se,
yes.
they're kind of saying, hey, that curriculum's not out there, that story's not out there. I can self-publish, or there's this small group that publish each other's book. Right now I'm doing, George Couros has the Innovator's Mindset.
Yes.
And he's doing, I mean, they're coming up with these brilliant models to get those ideas out there. Because what they did is they're offering a free MOOC, which is the Innovator Mindset MOOC. And they're each week, like tonight is going to be a Twitter chat. And each week they also have a Facebook Live event. And so they're crazy like a fox. What he does is he writes this book. He starts this free class for educators to learn about involving innovation in your K-12 classroom. And then you buy the book to go to his free class. And so now he also develops this network. And so there's this network. And so as I see on like my Twitter feed, the hashtag #IamMOOC is just blowing up because all of these people are like, wow, this is free. But then you're also getting all these really jazzed educators. That's your 10% right
Yes,
there.
yes, yes.
You get these educators that, you know, at midnight are reading this book and talking about how it's changing their ideas. And I think that's really where the future is going to be. The truth is how do we keep them in the schools? And in Oklahoma, that's a challenge right
Yes,
now.
yes.
Financially, that's a challenge. And you know, there's a lot of smart people that are trying to work on it, but part of it's going to be is we need to make those that are truly impassioned about education want to stay in education and know that the small things that they're doing, which they may feel are small, are moving the needle and helping them feel fulfilled in their work, and also know that they're helping Oklahoma or whatever state they live in to go forward. And that is, but I think that there is some really positive teacher-led movements. It's not necessarily led by states or by the nation. It's led by small groups of teachers, but I think that those groups are gaining, like right now South by Southwest EDU is going on, and I'm watching my Twitter feed and I'm seeing what the conversations are. You know, the needle is definitely in a different place than it was 5 years ago, don't you think?
This is great to hear, because that's what innovation looks like. It's not from a policy, it's from
Right.
individual minds. Remember what we said about what an engineer is, in our vision anyway? A person who envisions what's never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen. All of the people who are educators in K-12 that are taking the initiative to create this new curriculum are engineers, by our definition. These are people that we would be extremely proud of. There's one other tool that I'd like to mention that helps bring people to the table when it comes to getting students involved in interdisciplinary projects that lend purpose and intrinsic motivation, and that's grand challenges. So this has become kind of a catchword now. Most everybody's using the word grand challenges, but grand challenges are quite real. There's a very strong rationale for it from a large point of view. Here's the way we think of it, just in engineering. Not many kids wake up in the morning and say, my life's dream is to be a licensed engineer somewhere. Okay, it just doesn't happen. They don't even know what it is, so why would they? Okay, but it's really hard to find a high school kid who hasn't heard about global climate change, who hasn't heard about cybersecurity issues or nuclear war or famines in Africa, or simply the problem economic problem that as the population grows up to 9 billion by the center of this century, and the planet stays the same size, that our dream that every generation is going to have a lifestyle that's better than their parents is in risk. This isn't going to happen. Unless you can envision what's never been and do something to make it happen, it's not going to happen. And kids are worried about that. And if you can find a way in a middle school in Oklahoma to engage kids in a project, and it's not like changing the climate globally, but maybe you can do something in your classroom. You can get them to think proactively, to feel empowerment. And by the way, you can't do that by just applying arithmetic or chemistry, but you need all of that so it can draw a multidisciplinary group of teachers together who actually care about this as well. And it changes the conversation now. That kind of a project can be transformative.
Can I ask a question? I want to explore your definition a little bit.
Yeah.
I've talked to Rick over the years and have always been intrigued with the way he looks at the definition of engineering, of what an engineer is. Also, excuse me, inherent in that definition is the language sort of gets away from the distinguishing between mechanical, civil, electrical engineers, chemical engineers, and it's interdisciplinary in the way that it's stated. And my tentative hypothesis is this: I've when you've talked about engineers and what an engineer is, a person who envisions what's never happened and does whatever it takes to make it happen. I see a lot of similarities in almost any type of profession. For example, a teacher. And I think if someone says, what do you teach? Tim, what do you teach?
Science education.
Science education. Okay. It's sort of, if someone asks me that, I teach educational leadership. That's my answer. It's categorizing me into an area that this is what I do. It's pretty much the only thing I can do in those kind of things. But what I want my students to be I want my students to be very integrated in their approach to learning. I want them not to just be leaders, but good human beings and all these things. And so there's a language here. And so I want to explore that just a little bit. And we'll just talk about engineers right now, but in your opinion, what are the skills and dispositions that it takes for an engineer to be successful in this day and time? What are the skills and dispositions? We'll just talk about engineers, and I want to see if it applies to other areas.
Let me first explain why that generalized definition has use for us and why I think it does for everyone else too. About a year ago, when you looked at the kids who graduated at commencement, and I asked our placement officer to tell me, where are these kids going? What are they doing now? The most common job description for a kid who graduated from Olin was something called a user experience designer. Is that an engineer? What kind of an engineer? Is that a chemical engineer? Is that an electrical engineer? By the way, that title, user experience designer, did not exist when these kids enrolled as a freshman. And my prediction is the most common job description for a kid who graduates 4 years from now does not exist either. Okay? So hanging your hat on the technical details of a discipline which was created 100 years ago is probably not the wisest thing to plan for your future. The heart of it, I believe, is vision, and also the drive from inside, the intrinsic motivation to make things happen. By the way, that definition, envision what has never been and do whatever it takes to make it happen, could apply equally well at the business school to entrepreneurs. Every entrepreneur has that as a drive. It could also apply in the art school. Okay? You can't have a successful career in art unless you have vision that constantly generates new ideas and also the drive to make things happen. I don't know if you've ever been involved in a drama club in high school or ever had a kid that did this. What happens to their life a month before the play? Okay? It just blacks out. I mean, they don't even sleep they're trying to memorize their lines. This is what it means when you say, whatever it takes to make it happen. It's that kind of all-in commitment that anything, in fact, life is a project, okay? It's hard to imagine anything about life that isn't itself a project. It's not about multiple choice tests. So that's not the question you asked, though. So how would you describe the skill set for graduates and the dispositions for graduates who succeed as engineers? And number one, they obviously have to have familiarity with and confidence in their ability to use the tools of science and mathematics. That's implicit. But it turns out, by the way, a lot of kids today are getting much better STEM exposure in high schools than they did 10 years ago. We're seeing this, at least the ones that we see. I mean, you talk to Tom Landers here, and he'll tell you that their engineering school increased by 70%, their enrollment in just the last few years. These kids are coming from somewhere, so they're picking up the basics of mathematics and fundamentals of physics. But that doesn't make you an engineer, okay? It turns out that you can get a transcript with all A's in the medical school on anatomy, physiology, microbiology, and so forth. It does not make you a surgeon. You can't, at least I don't want you to operate on me until you've picked up a scalpel, okay? You have to actually use this in order to become a surgeon, and there's a great deal of judgment involved. What I think you're driving at is a lot of the people that we're talking to now in companies are talking about mindset. They're talking about a set of very specific sets of attitudes and behaviors that are critical to them in terms of employment. And there's 5 of them that we have identified from the interviews. I mean, for example, one of this group is called the STEM Connector. It's all one word. There's 6,000 corporations that put together a task force to try to identify the competencies that are necessary for the workforce in the future, for all of them. These mindsets are collaborative mindset, okay, an interdisciplinary mindset, an entrepreneurial mindset, an ethical or empathetic mindset, and a global mindset. So these are the 5. And that's really, there's nothing special about that. Each of them has a slightly different nomenclature, and that's my attempt to collate them from across lots of different industries. The collaborative mindset basically says it's comfortable, it's natural, it seems like you enjoy working with others. Given a choice, you would not eat alone. You would go and eat with that group of people over there, okay? Secondly, interdisciplinary means that you don't feel any sense of limitation that I am an expert in this one equation, and if anybody gives me a problem, I put that equation on it and I'm done, okay? That in fact, life is not about equations. Life is about real world situations that are complicated. And I am comfortable seeking out people who know stuff that I don't know so that we can together triangulate on what might really work. And that's a natural thing. It is not something that has to force you to do that. You just do that normally. The entrepreneurial mindset for us is a person who knows that the world could be a better place, but only if I take the initiative to make it happen. No one else is going to do it. Actually, the person that really did the best job in my world of explaining this is a guy named Peretz Levi. You probably never heard of him. Peretz is the president of the Technion in Israel. This is their MIT, okay? The Technion was chosen by Cornell University as a partner for the new Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island in New York. And the Wall Street Journal was exploring this, really curious, why would Cornell pick the Technion? I mean, if they haven't heard of Stanford, I mean, there's a lot of schools here. And the reason was, according to the interview, because the Technion is extraordinarily successful at generating spin-off companies from the tech work that happens in their region. In fact, on a pound-for-pound basis, they're like a singularity. So now the reporter was even more confused. How can this be? You're in Israel. Haven't you noticed? I mean, you're looking down the gun barrel at people from all around you. How could you possibly be? And Peretz said, no, so you've got it exactly wrong. He says, you can't live in Israel without being an optimist. You'd be insane. And you can't live here and be an optimist without imagining there could be a better world and know that it's up to us to invent it because no one else is going to do it for us. And it's that attitude, that core spirit of entrepreneurism that every company in America is looking for. And then there's this empathetic and ethical mindset, which has it's a very deep sense of social responsibility in doing things for others, as opposed to what can I get away with. And the final thing about a global mindset is a real problem in America, that most kids in America don't know that there's a world that exists, you know, west of San Francisco and east of New York. It's like, even if you go into the national news, you get the world in a minute, you know, and they tell you, and it's only where Americans are. It doesn't tell you what's happening to the rest of the world. You don't get that, by the way, with those international students that are here studying for a master's degree in engineering from India or from China. They know a lot more about the world than our students do. So those are the 5 things that they're asking for. And of course, it's implicit that they have the basic knowledge in the science, math, and engineering.
So when you said understanding the tool, I sort of paraphrase, understanding the tools of your trade.
Yes.
And so for engineer, that means math, science, and
Yeah.
everything. For artists, that would mean, you know, a certain set of
Yes.
skills. And
Yes.
So understanding the tools of your trade and then mindset.
But if you had to make a choice,
Yeah.
I think they would lean towards mindset. I can tell you this because I have had this odd experience of having taught graduate work at 3 different universities: University of California, University of Southern Cal, University of Iowa. And engineering is a field where a lot of foreign students want to come in and do graduate work. Something like 60 to 70% of the PhD students in America in engineering schools are from other countries, okay? Now, have you ever looked at the application for graduate admission of a student from China? Do you know anything about the university they graduated from? What does a letter of recommendation mean from this school? You know, they can buy them there. And it's the same thing in India. I mean, if you went to an IIT campus, then you have some sense, you know, the Indian Institutes of Technology, but there's a very small number of them. Turns out that we make decisions to admit people to graduate school who have a huge standard deviation in what they actually understand about the basics, even in the math and science. And this is true in every school I've been at. So what happens is the first year is what we call the melting pot year. And what you do is you repeat all the undergraduate stuff that you've had. You do it all over again, the first year graduate coursework, and now we teach you math the way we teach math, okay? And physics the way we teach physics. And not all of them survive, but most of them do. And one of the things that we've discovered is kids who come from Asia and from India and from the Middle East, this is just a sociological thing, having a kid who has a degree from the US in engineering is a big deal. This is bragging rights at holidays for the family. And so they have a lot of pressure from their family. Don't give up. This means so much to our whole family if you just get this degree. So they're motivated, okay? In many cases against what's reasonable. And you try to explain to them, this is not going to work out very well for you, but they're not going to quit, okay? It's that not going to quit thing that really carries them to enormous heights. And I've had, on the other hand, an awful lot of American kids who are really talented, who don't want to persist. They, well, I got a B last semester. I mean, how could I possibly do this? And they'll drop out. Mindset really matters. And this is not just about Carol Dweck, which is about what you believe about why you succeed. It's not just being smart, it's working hard. It's also about Angela Duckworth and grit, the will not quit, the determination. I don't think you learn grit without being through the crucible of crisis. There's kind of a U-shaped curve. The likelihood that you're going to be really successful with grit, if you had a start in life which is hopeless, is zero. Because you've never been able to fight through a circumstance which was really difficult and win. Because it was hopeless before you started, okay? You also can't win on the other end. If your father is Bill Gates, and it doesn't matter whether you got an A or not, you're going to inherit the company. And I don't know that this is true for Bill Gates, but families like that, it's really hard to learn grit. Yeah. They just don't. I mean, I've seen it. We have neighboring institutions that have very high percentages of foreign students, and they're all paying full tuition, room, and board, and their families own the bank in the national bank in their country. And you know what they're going to do when they go home. And those kids don't have the same sense of grit. It's a long answer. You never get short answers from me. Sorry about
All
that.
I have to do is just ask a question and
Go to sleep.
Well, lots of great answers. I think we're probably up against our time allotment here. And maybe just a final thought, to kind of come full circle on this, Mr. Brock, I've got your book on my bookshelf about leadership. And when I think about the definition of an engineer, envisions what's never been done and do whatever it takes, it feels like there's a ton of connection to what you were writing about. I don't know the exact publication date when you came out with that, but when you're talking about leadership and sort of entrepreneurship, there seems to be a really nice connection. So I want to say thank you, Mr. Brock, for making today happen. Thank you to the guests for a really thoughtful dialogue around STEM education, around not just some of the challenges, but some of the opportunities we have to move things in a better direction going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.